Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, we'd like to get started, if we can, please. Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone attending today. My name is Karen Burkhardt. I am the Executive Director of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. We're so pleased to welcome you to today's program, a conversation with Thom Shanker, Age of Danger, Keeping America Safe in the Era of New Superpowers, New Weapons, and New Threats. As I mentioned earlier, we do have some books for sale out there, and there will be time for a book signing after the program. So I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Richard Petritz Foundation, the Tiemens Foundation. Also want to recognize our institutional members, the El Pomar Foundation, University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, Pikes Peak State College, Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC, SIVA Charter High School, and Fountain Valley School. So thank you to all of those supporters. Today we have the distinct pleasure of hosting Thom Shanker. Thom Shanker is Director of the Project for Media and National Security at George Washington University, an appointment he accepted in 2021 after nearly a quarter-century career with the New York Times. At the Times, he served for 13 years as Pentagon Correspondent, covering the Department of Defense, overseas combat operations, and national security policy. Early in the war in Afghanistan, Mr. Shanker embedded with the Army Special Forces at Kandahar. He subsequently conducted dozens of reporting trips to Afghanistan and Iraq and embedded in the field with units from the squad and company level through battalion, brigade, division, and corps. Most recently, he served as Deputy Washington Editor for the Times, managing coverage of military, diplomacy, and veterans affairs. Please help me to welcome Thom Shanker.
Thank you, Karen, for that very generous introduction. It's an honor to be here at the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. I had the great joy of spending yesterday at Colorado College, my alma mater, as a guest of Professor Tim Fuller, who's here with us as well. My wife is also a CC graduate, and after kind introductions like that, she would want me to remind you of what she says to me every time I leave home, which is, remember, dear, you only used to be Thom Shanker. And it's also great to have Pikes Peak behind me. What a scenic mountaintop. Please don't make any jokes about how there's nothing above timberline. I wrestle with all of these things every day. I co-authored a book called Age of Danger because having spent most of my adult life covering the American military, covering the intelligence community, and covering national security policy, I really wanted to sort of step back at sort of the end of my professional life as I entered the post-ego part of my career and reflect on what I had learned and what I had seen. And it's so great because earlier, as I was mingling, there's so many here who have military experience, public service, intelligence experience, and it's a bit of a cliche, but it's true. I really do thank you all for your service, and those who are joining us here from the world of academia, the Air Force Academy, CC, Colorado Springs campus. Thank you for what you do, because there's probably no more important national security mission than creating an informed electorate. So for all of the educators here today, I thank you most sincerely. You know, Andy Thom, my co-author, Andy is the Senior VP for Research. Sir, is it audio bad? I spent a lot of time with the Army Special Forces, and they specialize in improvisation. So I was just trying to channel that. Great improvisation in the face of combat. My co-author for the book is a great guy named Andy Thom. He's Senior VP for Research and Development at the RAND Corporation. His past government service includes serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy. So a real big thinking job. And he was going to be the brains behind this operation. And Andy and I really wanted to write this book for a national audience. There's a lot of great national security and poli-sci work done inside the Beltway. But Andy and I felt that the national security debate in this great age of danger, it is too important to be left only to the chuckleheads in Washington. And so we wanted to come out, and I've been really on a mission to speak to World Affairs Councils. I've had the honor of being in Kentucky and Wyoming and Iowa and other places, and it's great to be here in Colorado Springs, the city I consider, if not my second home, maybe my third home. Why did we write this book? There are so many national security books out there. Andy and I believed that it's important to redefine national security and to get to a place of clearer definitions. Because how you define a problem defines the set of solutions, and more often than not will limit them because you fit the solutions basket into your definitions basket. And our major argument is that for 2 decades after 9/11, counterterrorism was the Zoom-like focus of American national security policy, crowding out all kinds of other issues that keep us safe. And for sure, 9/11, everybody in this room remembers where they were. It's so interesting to be on campus at Colorado College and talking to kids who weren't even born. And I spent 5 years in Moscow, and you mentioned Gorbachev, and it's like, okay. So it just makes me feel old, but for this audience, I'm sure everybody remembers where you were on 9/11. And that sense of fear and concern is completely natural and completely understandable. But what did this government do? This government, first a Republican administration and then a Democrat, so I'm a bipartisan critic here, please, but this nation and its national security apparatus defined terrorism as an existential threat. Remember those words coming from the White House podium? What does existential mean? Something that can destroy our existence. Al-Qaeda was a horrible organization. Loss of life was its creed. But even on its best day, Al-Qaeda could never have ended the existence of this nation. But it did prompt us to do things, spend money, pass laws that perhaps were overly done because we had so misdefined the problem. 3,000 people died on 9/11. This nation launched 2 wars, spent $2 trillion, 10,000 Americans killed or wounded in combat, lives disrupted, and deaths for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in countries across the Middle East. 3,000 deaths. Every death above 0 is a tragedy, and I feel for all the families who lost someone on 9/11. But compare that to COVID. COVID has taken 1 million American lives, our brothers and sisters, our countrymen and women. And this country never went on a mobilization like we did after 9/11. There was never even consensus on whether COVID was a national security threat, where it came from, and 1 million people died. And there are other deep vulnerabilities exactly like our vulnerability to pandemics that have gotten insufficient attention because of the 20-year focus on terrorism that is now finally coming to an end. To be sure, I would never say we can forget terrorism as a threat. I mean, look what's happening around the world now. I interviewed an FBI officer because the FBI is focused on the domestic threat. And he said the FBI wrestles with what he calls the 1% problem. If there's a 1% chance of a mass casualty terrorist attack, you have to spend 10, 20, 30, 40% of your attention, interest, and money. But we have to get the Zoom-like focus on counterterrorism to an expanded view of what are national security threats. And in our book, Andy and I walk through a list of them. And some of them I hope you'll agree with and find empathetic. Some you might disagree with. And there'll be time for your questions and comments and criticisms at the end of this. And I'm a tough guy, so let loose with your questions. But what are some of the things that we say are national security threats on a level that our entire government should be worried? Climate security is national security. Food security is national security. Biosecurity is national security. Technology security is national security. Data security, all national security threats on a level equal to or greater than the threat of terrorism as it exists today. But these problems are, even though they're well known, they are not traditional. And unfortunately, what Andy and I call the warning machine and the action machine in our government are not built to deal with these kinds of problems. Because our security cannot be defined only by tools that blow things up and kill people. These problems, climate security, health security, you can't win against them. You can only mitigate those problems. You can only manage them. And so we have thoughts about how we divide the government into the warning machine, which is not just the intelligence community, it's all the apparatus, the people who watch the world around us and are supposed to be there to warn us. And the action machine, which is the executive branch that takes decisions and takes action. The problem with the warning machine, and there are people here who have experience with the national intelligence estimates and these great documents, and Andy and I went through a number that were brilliant and perfect, like the national intelligence estimate on the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s is a crystal ball. The intelligence community predicted exactly what's going to happen. But as you saw with Iraq, less accurate. Even when the intelligence community gets it right, it warns clearly, but to quote Corinthians, occasionally with an uncertain trumpet. And so the executive branch can say, well, you warned me, but you didn't convince me, as Henry Kissinger once said about the October War in Israel. And on the executive branch side, a president's inbox is always full. I'm sure there are a number of senior executives here. You know what it's like. There are not enough hours in the day to get everything done. So what is the president worried about? Well, what the military calls the crocodile closest to the canoe. What's the problem that's going to affect you today and bite you in the you-know-where first? And you don't want that on the cover of the New York Times tomorrow. So the president's priorities are always today and tomorrow. His staff is always today and tomorrow, or until the next election. It's the fight for the next news cycle. And it's really important that both the warning machine and the action machine in our governments reset to make future having a seat at the table. We have to look at these future threats that are around the corner. Andy and I did it. I'm terrible at math, but we did a deep dive into the US government budget. And our calculation is that we spend about $1.2 trillion a year on national defense writ large. $800 billion on the Pentagon, the rest for the intelligence community, law enforcement, those sorts of things. So your tax dollars are $1.2 trillion a year to keep us safe. So how is it that we so often get it wrong or don't get it right? And we're not arguing to spend more money on national defense. We just think it needs to be spent smarter. And here's how we want to redefine national security, which then drive budgets. Climate security. I know everybody here in Colorado does not need to be told about the impact of climate. I mean, the wildfire seasons and all of that. We interviewed the head of the National Guard, great guy named General Hokanson. And the National Guard has deployed with America's active duty forces in every war except Vietnam. Guess what? The National Guard is not going to be available to go overseas in our national defense again because of climate change. General Hokanson talks about when he began his career, there were fire seasons. Now it's the fire year. And so they are busy at home dealing with the effects of wildfires, hurricanes, typhoons, floods, all of which are directly attributable to climate change. Yes, ma'am, exactly right. If you were a military planner, you're looking at the map of where all the huge American military bases are. Norfolk, Virginia, Bangor, Maine, Everett, Washington, Coronado. They're going to be underwater in 20 years because of rising sea levels. There's not enough money in the Pentagon budget to lift up all these huge installations. and nobody has the answer yet. Climate-induced migration. Problems around the world are being accelerated by climate change, and the American government and its military will be called upon to help mitigate them. The horrific civil war in Syria has a huge climate component because there was drought and farmers moved to the cities, which upset the ethnic balance of the government, and so the civil war began. Piracy off the Horn of Africa. Those pirates used to be fishermen, able to take care of their families. But then the Japanese factory ships came in, overfished. What did they do to earn a buck? They turned to piracy. My favorite, and if there are any screenwriters in the audience, this is one you should do for your next movie. We interviewed a terrific naval officer, Rear Admiral Gilliam. He's the Navy Surgeon General, so the highest ranking medical officer in the Navy. And we asked him, what keeps you up at night? And he says, the melting polar ice cap carries a risk that it could release pathogens that have been frozen for a millennia or more into the world. And that these are pathogens for which we don't have any kind of defense. And his sailors are going to sail right into them first and bring those infections back here. That's what keeps them up at night, and that's climate change related. I've made a point to really, as I mentioned earlier, travel all around the country. And the problem with discussing climate change is for too long in our highly polarized, highly partisan country where we live right now, whether you're Republican or Democrat, I think we all agree this country is incredibly polarized today. Climate change is one of those polarized issues. You have tree huggers versus those who want to drill, baby drill, right? So Andy and I really thought hard about how we can convene through our book and in conversations like this, a way to redefine climate security as national security in a way that can bring together left, right, red, blue. And a couple of ways to do that. You appeal to people's interests. I was in Texas talking to a group just like this. And afterwards, one of the Gulf Coast's largest construction bosses came up to me and he said, you know, all of my buddies at the golf course, they don't believe in climate change. I said, come with me and talk to my insurance adjuster. I was in Wyoming, speaking to a group exactly like this. Great, educated, thoughtful people, left, right, Democrat, Republican. And afterwards, a man came up. He's one of Wyoming's biggest cattle ranchers. And he says, you know, he's a real red state Republican, but he's deeply concerned about climate change because all of the all of the surface water on his ranch is being polluted with tiny particles of plastic being carried by the atmospheric ocean from China. So there are ways to talk about these important national security issues in ways that bring us together and don't divide us. And that's why climate change is so important to me. I've become really just obsessed with it, and I apologize to my grown sons about every week for the world that we're going to leave them with. But there certainly is hope. The US government, the Pentagon, and others are saying all the right things. The recent agreements are at least tapping the brake on global temperatures. And the goal is to stay below the 3 degrees centigrade, 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit. We're not there yet. If we have commitment, if those rules are followed, there's a chance that we can actually save our planet. But as the Pentagon's top climate person said to us, you can say all the right words, but a plan without money is a fantasy. And we still have not redirected our budgets away from legacy national security issues and legacy systems to battle climate, which is really a huge threat. Something where, you know, you write a book over a couple of years and you really get educated. I'd never focused on food security before. And you think about pandemic, and people said, oh, we weren't ready for COVID because it had been 100 years since we had a pandemic. Well, guess what? It's only been 150 years since the previous catastrophic potato blight. And it's called the Irish famine, mostly because it was the Irish migration to New England that defined it. But it was really the European potato famine, right? And it had similar effects to the pandemic of 1918. And we've forgotten about it. And there's great research going on because there's great fear that whether man-made, as in terrorist, or naturally occurring pathogens and blights could harm our economy and our lives the same way that COVID did and caught us by surprise. And there's very little attention to food security. There's even a more direct warning coming out of the war in Ukraine. You know, one of Russia's asymmetrical tools to cripple the Ukrainian economy was to attack all those wheat exports coming out of Ukraine, because Ukraine depends so much on that money. And Russia was sinking those wheat ships, or because of the threat, the ships weren't even sailing. To be sure, that affected Ukraine. But you know what really affected? The populations in Africa, who had their wheat supplies stolen from them. So I think food security is also an incredibly important one. We don't ignore the traditional threats, Russia and China, because it would be foolish to do so. My co-author Andy, as I said, was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy under Don Rumsfeld. In the summer of 2001, a quiet, sleepy time in Washington before September, Andy wrote the required 4-year annual review of our national defense strategy. The big focus was China. And it called for the US to realign its spending away from the former Soviet Union, away from Russia, and look at China. September 11th came, and the orders came down from the top that said to rewrite the strategy document to focus on terrorism. And Andy said, but what about China? And he was told, we have 20 years to get China right. That was 24 years ago. And we still haven't gotten China right. And it's really, really terrifying. We were so circling the strategic cul-de-sac of the Middle East for 20 years that we didn't pay attention as we should to China. People often ask, well, what do we do about China? And sort of just a personal aside, the most meaningful part of my life after the New York Times, please don't tell my dean at GW, but I'm a volunteer with the McLean Volunteer Fire Department. I'm on the admin side. I help with outreach, public information, hands-only CPR training in the schools. About a month ago, my partner and I trained 1,200 middle schoolers in hands-only CPR. Exercise and patience, extremely rewarding. But what I've learned hanging out with these amazing career and volunteer firefighters is that when you go to fire school now, it's not called firefighter school. It's called fire suppression. They've redefined the problem brilliantly. It's because better construction, better sprinklers, smoke alarms, response time in your first due area is minutes, not longer. And so fortunately, deaths due to fires and financial damage is a lot less because the emphasis is on suppressing fires before they start and not fighting them. And that analogy is what we should do with China. We don't want to fight a war with China. We want to suppress a war with China. So fire suppression, not fires fighting. And I know there's a terrific retired Air Force officer at our table today, and I don't like to pick among the services as like your kids. Which kid do you like best? Which service do you like best? I'm not going to tell you. But the Air Force is doing some incredibly smart work thinking about China. Because the legacy systems the military has for peer threats are long-range bombers and aircraft carriers. The carriers still have a vital role in the Red Sea, Eastern Med, other places. But against China, that has an incredible array of missiles and precision targeting, our aircraft carriers will have to operate at distances that make them not unusable. They're still important, but they will not be able to carry out the mission for which they were designed against China. China has fielded so many missiles that the Pentagon even has a name for it. A2AD, anti-access area denial, which pushes the carriers back beyond the second island ring. If carriers came within that, it is not inconceivable that one would get sunk, and this country would lose as many military personnel in one day as we lost in the entire war in Afghanistan. We are not ready for that. And so some great Air Force officers have been working on redefining how you deter China. And one of their great ideas that we write about is through drones, because the key is to overwhelm China with inexpensive weapons, tens of thousands of them, that are all attritable, which is a fancy word for if we lose them, we don't care because we have a lot more. Aircraft carriers are not attritable. All these drones are. You could cover the skies over the Taiwan Strait like iPhones with wings, watching everything China is doing, so that China would never be able to think it could do a sneak attack. You arm a lot of them as suicide weapons, which the Ukrainians, home built, have used with devastating effect against Russian armor in the war. Still in the idea stage. Question we had a year ago when our book came out is, would this be adopted or not? And I'm happy to tell you as a taxpayer that in September, this past September, the Deputy Defense Secretary, Kath Hicks, signed an order starting something called the Replicator Program. What is it? Research and quick fielding of tens of thousands of drones exactly like we're talking about. Now, there is resistance. With all due respect, even the Air Force is not totally behind this, because the Air Force wants to keep its fighter and bomber fleet. The Navy is all about the carriers, but we have to redefine our thinking, to redefine ways that we spend money. By the way, that's your money. The government prints money, but you write them the check every 15th. You need to be invested in how the government spends money in your name to keep us all safe. China is one of those issues that to me really overlaps in so many ways. We talked about data security, cyber security. I'm sure you all have heard for years the threat of a cyber Pearl Harbor, right? That somehow an enemy would turn off the lights on the East Coast, crash our financial system, all that. That's not impossible, but it hasn't happened yet, thank goodness. Andy and I argue that cyber Pearl Harbor has already happened and nobody even noticed. And it's the Chinese theft of intellectual property worth trillions of dollars. It's no surprise that the newest Chinese stealth fighter looks exactly like ours. How could that be? So it wasn't, a major attack. It was a cat burglar in the night over 10, 12 years that was far more catastrophic so far than any individual cyber attack. And we weren't ready for it because we defined cyber as this catastrophic event where the Chinese were under our radar in cyber. That's a mixed metaphor, sorry, but that's what they did. A threat that we all know about now, but received inattention for too long, is the threat of a newly aggressive Russia. I spent 5 years based in Moscow. The time my wife recalls us 5 winters. We're still together, but she never lets me forget how cold. I came home one night, middle of winter in Moscow, and you live in Soviet-built. I was there from 85 to 91. I came in with Gorbachev, left after there was no more Soviet Union. So there was no free market. We lived in Soviet-built buildings. I came home one January night and found my wife in the kitchen with a down coat, with the stove open, her feet in the oven, reading a book. I said, "What are you doing?" And she lit a match and held it up to the window, and the wind coming through the window blew out the match. I said, "I love you so much." Russia, we call the threat hiding in plain sight. Because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I was there. Glorious moment for the world. Great hope, great anticipation. I covered Ukraine's vote for independence in August of 1991. And Putin's trying to roll that back now. But for many, many years, because of the focus on terrorism, people didn't focus on Russia or the threat. They just decided Putin's a blowhard, Russia is upper Volta with rockets, it's a gas station, we don't need to worry about it. I covered Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. I was there because the new Defense Secretary Robert Gates was dispatched by President Bush to mend ties with NATO. But he was really upstaged the first day by Putin, who gave a speech that was unexpectedly and powerfully vitriolic. Putin called out the US for being a hyperpower. He declared the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan were illegal. And he said, most importantly, that he was back on the world stage to correct the greatest evil of the 20th century, which was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Put aside trench warfare, World War II, the Holocaust. No, the collapse of the Soviet Union to Vladimir Putin is the worst thing of the 20th century. When he said in 2007, he described the map of the Russia as he imagined it, with himself as the new czar, which would include all of what he described as former Russian territories, including Georgia and Ukraine. Nobody paid attention. Nobody believed him. People thought it was for a domestic audience. We were too focused on terrorism. That was spring of 2007. In 2008, he invaded Georgia, exactly as he said he was going to do. In 2014, he invaded Ukraine for the first time. Remember the invasion a couple years ago? That was his second invasion. And this one, he took Crimea, Donbass, and other areas. Andy and I interviewed the NATO commander who was in charge in 2014 for the first Ukrainian invasion by Russia. He told us he had no tactical warning whatsoever. With all the warning and all the satellites and all the intelligence, the NATO commander, an American four-star Air Force General, General Breedlove, said he had no tactical warning. He said he was so angry he flew back to Washington and met with the heads of the American intelligence community. What he was told was, we blinded ourselves. On the day the Berlin Wall went down in '89, 50% of the intelligence budget was watching the Soviet Union. By the time Russia invaded in 2014, that 50% had dropped to 15%. The day before the Berlin Wall fell, there were 15,000 experts, analysts, operatives, looking at, warning about the Soviet Union. By 2014, that 15,000 had dropped to 11,000. So it's no wonder that we were surprised. As we think about what to do, Andy and I actually have some proposals. And what we don't want to see is another major muscle movement like happened after 9/11 with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, Northern Command here in town. NORAD became Northern Command to protect the homeland. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence was stood up. All those are great. We don't want things undone, but we don't want more stuff done. We take an idea from the military for standing joint task forces. And the military is very agile in pulling just the right people together in what they call task organizing for a specific job or mission. And so the categories we talk about, health security, climate security, data security, we would envision bringing all the people from all the various parts of the government who have an equity and an expertise. They get together 4 or 6 times a year, swap cell phone numbers, do war games, practice, so that when something bad happens, you're not starting from a standing position. You already know the players. Maybe you've stockpiled some materials. You have ideas because you practiced. Think about what would have happened if there had been a health task force already up and running before COVID hit. But to organize that with no structure in place whatsoever, we lost so much time and we lost so many lives. I'm a very apolitical person. The story I like to tell when I was covering the Pentagon. It was the end of George W. Bush's first term. Don Rumsfeld was still Defense Secretary. So it was the 2004 elections. John Kerry was running as the Democrat. I was walking down the hall in the Pentagon, doing my job, walking the beat. And Rumsfeld and this posse of aides was coming the other way. He said, "Shanker, what are you still doing here?" I said, "Mr. Secretary, unless you've ordered me thrown out of the building, I'm still the New York Times Pentagon correspondent. I'm on the beat doing my job." Rumsfeld said, "That's not what I meant. I thought everybody at the New York Times was out campaigning for John Kerry." And I said, "Mr. Secretary, I will make a bet with you. I will bet you a bottle of wine you can't guess how I vote for president." He said, "Shanker, that's easy. You vote Democrat." I said, "Mr. Secretary, I don't vote." And since then, I've learned that a lot of senior military officers don't vote. Supreme Court justices traditionally do not vote. So I'm not saying you shouldn't vote. In fact, please vote. It's so important. However you vote this year, it's so important. But as the New York Times Pentagon correspondent, it was essential to me to have this mask of neutrality and nonpartisanship. And Rumsfeld paid up with a very nice bottle of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, which my wife and I enjoyed very, very much. And we toasted the deployed forces in the field, so everybody wins. But it goes to the point that when we are polarized, we are not safe. When we are crippled by partisanship, we are not safe. When we're paralyzed by division, we're not safe. And I'm not a Pollyanna, friends, really not. I know there have been political divisions on foreign policy since the beginning of time. But it's hard to find a time as polarized as this until you go back to before World War I. That's about how far back you have to go. And this kind of broad, centrist agreement on national security has served our nation well. And I really hope that our elected leaders of whichever party, by whatever name you vote for, can get us there again. Do you know who's happiest by our polarization? Russia and China. They benefit. People often ask me about Chinese and Russian electoral interference. And it's like, I don't know why they do it, because we're doing it to ourselves. I mean, people often ask me, are we in a new Cold War with Russia? And again, definitions matter. I say, no, we're not in a new Cold War with Russia, because Putin's already at war with the West. Our democracy is amazing. It's hard to take our country to war. We have a real default, war, peace, and that's good. That's how we want our country to be. Not Putin. Putin has a rheostat of tools to use. And really, what is election interference but an attempt at regime change? That's what Putin's doing. It's an act of war. His invasion of Ukraine, a sovereign nation who's in discussion for NATO membership, was nothing but an attack on Western freedoms, Western values, Western independence. So we are not in a new Cold War with Russia. Putin's already at war with us. And time is wasting. Just a couple of final thoughts before I stand by for your tough questions. And any topic is on the table, from my speech or anything else on your mind. When I think about what has kept our country strong, it's that we all, at least in past decades, had a shared version of reality. We defined reality the same way. There were disagreements, of course there were, but we had sets of facts that we all agreed upon. And we're not there anymore. And what troubles me, when too many people, especially young people, only get their news from this guy. You've trained this guy to send you news only about things you already know, and essays that only reaffirm views you already hold. This is the daily me. And I want us to get back to the daily we. I have a dear friend, a grad school buddy, who has a radio show on Sirius. And he ends every show by saying, "Do me a favor, tomorrow morning, read an article with which you disagree. Read an essay with which you disagree. Read a publication whose viewpoint you know is one you disagree with. And somehow I hope to spend another generation to get us back to where it's a daily we in our national dialogue. And finally, what really concerns me most of all, when you look at how President Xi of China has sworn to have a military force capable of retaking Taiwan in 2 or 3 years. Not that he would do it, but he wants the capable force. When you see North Korea expanding its nuclear arsenal, expanding its missiles, when you see Russia invading the sovereign territory of an independent nation and threatening to go further, when you see Iran arming malign forces in Syria and in Yemen, disrupting global shipping, when you see all the leaders of those countries creating a new arc of authoritarianism. I mean, they don't need to meet at Yalta or aboard a battleship at sea to plan a common front. They just know what to do. But there is a new arc of authoritarianism forming. And my greatest fear is that at some point in the not too distant future, we're going to look at this time period and realize that World War III already began and we didn't even know it. Thank you very much. And truly, I'm a tough guy. Throw any question at me that you want.
Just takes a second. Sometimes we also she's on.
We're going to Q&A now. So please raise your hand high. I will over in that question.
Try it.
If you want to do it from the floor, I can repeat it for whatever's good for
Okay,
you.
yeah. Maybe just stand and
Yeah, Tom, thank you so much for coming here. It's the same question I wanted to ask in the previous one. I've heard lots of presentations, and yours was fantastic, about talking about what we need to be doing. But a strategy is a meeting of resources and objectives. What are we doing too much of? What should we not be doing to go after the issues that you so well included?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. This
Can you pull up with Doug?
I've been, there you go. This man here belongs in theater. His question I know projected over everywhere, and it's a great question. As I said, we are slowly moving back from the huge focus on terrorism. So those funds, Afghanistan, Iraq, we've done. Testing. You know, I'm sure there's a lot of people in business here. Fading. Those of you who are in business, you could never up the way the Pentagon does. You know, during the years of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Pentagon had its base budget. And then because the money for the wars was so overwhelming, the leadership knew the US population and Congress wouldn't accept it. So they created another budget. It wasn't off the books, but pretty close. It was called the OCO, the Overseas Contingency Operations Account, which was massive. Now, what company can have 2 sets of books and claim to its taxpayers that it is a good steward of their money? So withdrawing funds from terrorism, which is happening now, and then a real look at some of these legacy systems. I mean, again, I love the Navy, I love the aircraft carriers, but we've got to find money from adding to the legacy systems to invest in these new technologies, like the drones and those sorts of things. And especially, you know, beef up our standing in the Pacific. There's something that we could do that would help a lot, and it's not cost-free because diplomats have salary and fly in airplanes. But we need to create a firmer alliance and partnerships all around China, not containment, but we're going to need more bases in Japan and more in the Philippines and more in Australia, and we're trying to do that. And one positive thing about government policy, China only has clients. The US has real allies. And that is a true value for our national security.
Thanks. Josh Vandenberg at UCCS. You beat me my question a little bit in raising the issue of microplastics, the Wyoming rancher. I'm wondering whether there's some language that isn't the language of climate security, something between that and biosecurity that encompasses things like microplastics, which we're probably producing too, or this other phenomenon of pesticides, herbicides, and all these things that are affecting our hormonal balances, our endocrine system. I'm hearing about that from the right and the left, increasing concern about endocrine disruption. I mean, that would be a national security threat if our actual bodies are not functioning the way that they used to. So I'm wondering if you have a concept to capture that kind of concern as a security concern.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I didn't want to read the entire book to you, but we actually talk about that. I mean, biosecurity is a part of it, and especially with AI and CRISPR technology. I mean, you can't quite yet create a bioweapon in your garage, but it's getting close to that. And so it really is important. And this is one of those issues where a public-private partnership will have to be established, both for cyber and data security and for biosecurity, because so much of the most important research and development and knowledge is in the private sector. But the government still has the best toys, and so we need to come to a new partnership. We interviewed Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, who is seized with the questions that you're talking about. And we actually wrestled with whether or not to put this in the book, but because there's now a novel out about it, and movies we did. You know, Andy, my favorite question is what keeps you up at night? Eric Schmidt, one of the smartest men in the world, CEO of Google, says what keeps him up at night is the marriage of AI and new biotechnologies that would allow an adversary to synthesize a lethal virus targeted at an individual based on their DNA, whether it's a president or the president's kids or anybody, for blackmail or destruction. And in an even more nefarious world, you could define this similar killer virus to go after races of people, or in my case, those who carry the Tay-Sachs gene, Jewish people. This is not impossible to do, and it could soon be a spreading technology. And so Schmidt's found this thing called the Special Competitive Studies Project. It's trying to bring security to this new and scary world of AI, supercomputers, and advanced biotechnology. So your concern, Professor, is absolutely valid.
All right, thank you for answering our questions. My name is Kate, I'm with UCCS, and I just have a question regarding your redefinition. Because I think there's an argument to be heard about whether or not national security is used as sort of a scapegoat for times of crisis. And I'm curious if you think that this redefinition sort of changes that balance in away from the balance of democratic principles and into the ability of a government to take advantage of that. So I guess, how do you balance the democratic principles and security itself with this new definition?
Yeah, it's a super fair question, and I think that all of this should be done within the rule of law and with respect to institutions and rights of privacy. To refine your question a little bit, it came up on at CC yesterday, it goes to the question of if everything is defined as like somebody who's really into climate, and she very, passionately didn't want climate redefined as a national security problem, because to her, national security means the military. And that concern is very similar to yours. And I think we have to avoid that. And how we do it is by digging deeper into our book. As we say, these are problems that cannot be solved with traditional military tools. You can't kill your way out of a climate crisis. You can't kill your way out of a pandemic. But for the 20 years of terrorism, when the military was the go-to tool of all government policy, there's kind of a military axiom that says, if all you have is a hammer, you define every problem as a nail. And that's what we did. I mean, I embedded in Afghanistan and Iraq over and over for 13 years. As much as I did and do respect our men and women in uniform, I used to kind of rankle at why are American fighting forces assuring the rights of education for women and girls? Absolutely valid national policy goal. But why is the military doing it? Why is the military digging sewers, building schools, helping with democratization? Because the rest of the government is underfunded. State Department's underfunded. Health and Human Services, Department of Education, they're underfunded and they have no deployable forces. So those missions fell to military personnel. God bless them all with their can-do spirit. But so your redefinition and mine are actually have a lot more in common. We have to get it away from a military problem. And what we found after 20 years, even this hammer didn't work against terrorism because you can rack and stack bad guys like cordwood, but you will never defeat terrorism unless you go after the root causes: poverty, poverty of education, poverty of hope. And that's a problem that leaders from around the world should listen to. You see people making mistakes as if they hadn't watched the past 20 years of American history.
My concern is in our democracy, every 4 years it changes. So how do you bring I loved your book, I really enjoyed it. How do you ever get through looking 5 or 10 years ahead in these various areas to have it be implemented when it becomes so political? We're in a more authoritarian environment, it would be done.
So it's a really fair question. It's one I wrestle with all the time. Sure. Yeah. So in our country, due to our wonderful democracy, we change governments every 4 years or 8 years. So how do you find the continuity to implement the sorts of things that we're writing about? A couple of great interest your question. You're absolutely right. And that's why I'm arguing for a return to a centrist consensus foreign policy. Because for many decades after World War II, whether it was a Democrat or a Republican, the foreign policy was fairly agreed upon. Support NATO, stand up to Soviet expansionism, try to spread democracy around the world. But now we have very stark choices ahead of us. And again, I'm not telling you how to vote. I'm not taking sides here, but you have one candidate for president who believes in alliances and our European partners, and one who says, I don't care if Putin attacks a NATO member. Now, Trump defends that by saying it's just a warning to NATO to pay their fair share. But I'm saying there are real choices ahead of us. And also, again, not to get partisan, but when people criticize the deep state, I actually love the deep state. Because the deep state are all the people who get out of bed in the morning and go to work and are implementing rules and regulations in a fairly nonpartisan manner. They're just trying to get school lunches paid for and toys inspected before they go to market and food tested so it doesn't have botulism. I mean, the people at the FDA who are looking for botulism in spinach, they're not left or right, they're just doing their job. So fortunately, we still have this stable, if malign, deep state to carry us forward, but you're absolutely right. What leaders say at the top really, really matters. And I think you can make the case that the coming presidential election is one of the most important since World War II, maybe even since World War I. I mean, it's just that important to try to get it right. We write about, there are people here who know the intelligence community and the national intelligence estimates. The CIA, for better or worse, did away with its warning officers some years ago. There were people who were charged. You look at the world, you warn us that bad stuff is coming. They did away with them as a cost-cutting measure under the argument that every analyst should be a warning officer. Okay, kind of makes sense. But if it's not your job to be responsible for warning about X, Y, or Z, that's not what your priority is. So we really have to empower people in government to look around the corner, to look to the horizon. One idea we had for the book, which we rejected as unworkable, was to have a national security advisor like we have now. But that person, as I said, is always drawn in to the daily crisis. And have a second national security advisor responsible for the future.
Right.
Great idea. Can you imagine the East Wing turf fighting between those two people for the president's time? So even though it makes sense on paper, given the way bureaucracies work, it just probably wouldn't. But your concern is our concern, exactly. So thank you.
So, I have a question about Elon Musk as an example, not as a lone individual, but you have a person who has the ability to shut down all of our radar capability as regards to like Ukraine, for example, which he did for political purposes or whatever you think about that. But do you guys have you and your co-writer have any ideas about how to, I don't know, somehow recreate a balance so that the majority of people who are of goodwill have some power versus one person who may or may not be stable, may or may not be have the best interest of the U.S. Has so much influence over global events that are pretty crucial. So.
Yeah. It's not a question we explored in the book, although it's important for society. Political scientists would call it, a hyper-powered individual, and they are out there. But they've really been there since the beginning of time. I don't know Elon Musk well enough to really comment on him. So I'm going to avoid answering, not because it's not a really important question, but I just have no wisdom to share with you that would be valuable. I'm sorry.
I think I was just worried about our individual having the power to shut down radar.
Yeah, GPS, right? It was the Starlink. Again, yeah, it was GPS. So again, I'm not here to defend or attack Musk. Goodness knows he doesn't need me to do either. I'm a little molecule. But I do talk to Pentagon folks and in the Air Force, excuse me. And the question comes up, well, if we start letting Elon Musk launch all of our national security satellites, could he pull the plug on them? And what this officer says, I have no independent reporting, is that Elon Musk has never broken a contract with the American government. So that may not be enough reassurance for you. What happened in Ukraine was indeed very worrisome, but it's also very, very different. So again, I wish I had a really good answer for you. It's my shortcoming that I don't. I'm sorry.
But if I could just follow up on her point, for the government to move faster through public-private partnerships, they're totally different cultures, right? Private culture, the way decisions are made, is really different. So going forward in the future, is there an office in DARPA or some government office that studies this kind of question?
So I don't know about DARPA, but the example that we look to, because you're right, the cultures are diametrically opposed. I mean, governments don't have to make profits, first of all. And the only stockholders that matter are those that vote in November. An example is that gasoline pipeline that was shut down by a cyber attack a couple years ago. And that was a criminal activity, but probably abetted or at least a blind eye by Russia. That company, the pipeline company, did not tell a soul about it for several days until the impact was felt for all of us on the East Coast, believe me. And afterwards, during the deconstruction, they said, look, we have all of this proprietary information. We have to worry about our stockholders. We wanted to solve it ourselves. But the government said, once you told us about it, we zap those bad guys in a couple of hours. That's what we do for a living. We have much better toys than you do. And so your question is a completely valid one, but the way to bridge the cultures is through contracts and negotiations and understanding. The government can say, we get your need for profit, we get your proprietary information, but you have to open the kimono and show us what's going on. And we promise not only will we tell your competitors what's going on, but if we see a low level of things we don't think you should be doing, we're going to turn a blind eye for now for the greater good. And this concept is called eyes on, hands off. And there are people working on the exact kinds of agreements that we're talking about.
We read your book.
Thank you.
I think I turned it off. We read your book in a book group, and I must say it generated some of the most interesting conversations we've ever had. However, it was terrifying. I'm telling you people, this book is terrifying. And
I'm so sorry. I apologize.
as a journalist, I imagine that there's been a fair amount of your career where you felt like you were talking to an empty closet. Pay attention to this. What? Did you miss that? And whatever it was. And frankly, I think you have a pretty strong audience here in terms of interest, education, and ability. The average Joe, I know because I'm one of those hysterical people on the board, really doesn't want to hear what's going to happen that is bad. Look at the yo-yos who wouldn't get vaccinated or wear masks. But in the grand scheme of things, to whom are you speaking? Because, I don't think any of my neighbors are going to be losing sleep about the Chinese building up their military. And it's disturbing to me from the point of view of how many intelligent, capable people can carry the bloody world on their shoulders when the majority of people are trying to put their head in the sand. And ostriches actually don't do that. I grew up in Africa, never saw an ostrich with his head in the sand. I believe I have seen some people in Monument with their heads in the sand. That I've seen. So what are you going to do about it? Are 12 people in the world going to save it?
So thank you for your question. Thank you for reading the book. And part of what I do about it is I come and meet with incredibly intelligent, informed, and committed audiences like this. Andy and I are almost evangelical about going out onto the hustings. And we've tried to reach out, again, not just beyond the Beltway, but beyond. I love being with the World Affairs Council, but I've spoken to business roundtables, to Lions clubs, scout troops. Anybody who will give me a microphone and will sit for an hour, I will go talk to them. I'm reminded, it's kind of anyway, it's just really important to stay out there and keep talking. And I don't think there's ever been a time in history where the majority of Americans were involved in these questions. But we don't need that. We just need to expand the number of thoughtful people like all of you here. I don't care what your party is, I don't care how you're going to vote, but the fact that you're here engaging in these questions in such a thoughtful way gives me hope. When I was on campus yesterday with Professor Fuller, it's a cliche that people like me couldn't get into Colorado College now. I'm just not smart enough. And then there's a bit of a cliche about how college campuses are partisan and into all the woke debates and stuff. And if they are or not, I don't care. I spent an entire day with students who were thoughtful and earnest and concerned and outward-looking, not inward-looking. The only thing they didn't like is when I told them to get off their damn phones and read a newspaper. They didn't much agree with that. But I really, going back to Washington this evening, really a little more optimistic about our future if the young people I met with yesterday are any sign. And the people who concern you, there's not a lot that we can do about it. And I will tell you that Adlai Stevenson story. It will get me in trouble. But when he was running for president, he was at a campaign stop, and someone held up a sign that said, "All thinking Americans are for you, Adlai," to which he said, "Yes, but it takes a majority to win." And fair enough, that's sort of elitism is one of the reasons he didn't win, but it's an excellent, it's almost a Churchillian line. It's so good. Sir?
I have a next question. I don't need this attention by now. Your background in special forces was conservative elements of the military, and then going and writing for the New York Times, which many people consider one of the most liberal newspapers in the country. So for me, it was not at all unusual, because I'm a Wall Street Journal reader, not at all, that climate security and I'm glad you did not use the word climate change, thank you, was the top of the article, whereas China and Russia and the bad authoritarian nations are toward the bottom. How do you reconcile all of these things when you look at something like, for example, the current administration ruling about not selling our natural gas to our allies in Europe? The reason I say that is because their source of natural gas prior to the Ukrainian invasion was Russia. How do you reconcile all this given your background?
Sure, and I love people with theatrical voices. Thank you, sir. And it's a great question. Just to clarify, I wasn't in Special Operations Forces. I just embedded with them a lot. A very small group of us had that great honor. I'm not an expert on national gas sales, but to be sure, you know, we need to support our allies with energy resources. And I know this was a huge question with Germany. Again, I'm not a alternative fuel energy expert, but I do think that it's amazing to see countries like Norway investing in wind, or the Emiratis looking at small modular reactors, because they know fossil fuels are just not forever. As far as the Biden administration's specific policy on gas sales to Europe, as I told your table mate, not an area of my expertise. My wife always tells me to exercise my brain before my mouth, so I can't, and I'm sorry, I just cannot give you a thoughtful answer. It's clear you are far better informed on this than I am, so.
Any other questions?
There was a 60 Minutes on Sunday, had an article, an episode about the laws of the sea. And the basic issue was there are very valuable minerals in the subsurface of the ocean. And there's a treaty that's been proposed by under the United Nations auspices to design that. And all the defense personnel, at least according to this report, had supported this treaty. Secretaries of State have supported this treaty. 160-some nations had signed the treaty, but not the United States, because 34 senators, all in one party, opposed it. So my question kind of is, and the argument against it was, why do we want to be subject to a law supported by the United Nations when we believe that other treaty signers would not, they'd sign it, but they would follow the law, citing China particularly. So this kind of gets to the question of, when you start looking at the alliances issue, the argument about whether or not you should be in alignment with the United Nations and the rest of the world on something like that, versus, no, let's not be something so we can do whatever we want. How do you see that argument as a matter of national security?
Sure.
Because this was a national security issue in the end.
Yeah, I mean, those nodules are a source of untold riches and untold energy and all sorts of stuff. You know, there are so many examples of this. You know, the United States is not a signatory to the International Criminal Tribunal at The Hague because this country has a policy that we try our own soldiers under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Very understandable. But we sure like to use The Hague against other people, don't we? and so there is a certain contradiction, irony, dare I say hypocrisy about American policy, not just for the law of the sea treaty, but for the International Criminal Tribunal, and even about NATO. The only place I get partisan is I'm a huge fan of alliances. That's been America's asymmetrical strength over all of our adversaries since the Cold War. And I think people who call for leaving NATO, undermining NATO, even if it's a rhetorical point urging Russia to invade NATO, forget that Article 5, the one for all and all for one, if anyone's attacked, we all come to your defense, has only been invoked once, on 9/11, by this country, and all of our allies came to help. Yes, ma'am.
You alluded to that it is not the conflict between China and Taiwan, and I have a lot of Taiwanese friends, and it's not a matter of if they're going to do it, they're being attacked, but it's a matter of when. Do you believe that our alliances are so strong that they will come to the aid of little Taiwan? Because you kind of left that up in the air.
And is it gonna be another Ukraine where they get invaded and then it goes on for 3 years or so? Could you repeat that question?
Sure. It's a question about Taiwan. And we talked about how China has a policy to have the military capabilities to invade in 2 or 3 years. The decision hasn't been made, but they want the capabilities, which is quite frightening. And she's asking, will we respond and will our allies respond? So, again, allow me to answer your question by redefining it and referring to what I said earlier. If we get into a war with China, allies or not, Japan, South Korea, Philippines or not, it's going to be horrible for all the world. And what we have to do, ma'am, is prevent that from happening. And all these essays are written about our warfighting capabilities, and they do these war games. I have friends who are running these war games. Every time they run it, all that happens is we lose faster. So we have to do everything we can to instill and inject doubt in the minds of the Chinese leadership that it will be easy or successful at a cost that doesn't disrupt all of President Xi's plans for economic development. And so that's what we need to do. Build these alliances, invest in the replicator program, show resolve toward Ukraine, because the Russians are watching, US support for Ukraine waning. President Xi is really watching. And if he sees us walk away from Ukraine, he's going to know Taiwan is his when he's ready. So again, your question is great, but I'd rather answer it not by talking about what happens when we go to war, but all the stuff we need to do to prevent that war from happening. That's where our effort and focus, we need to redefine away from war to war prevention. So I want to thank you all for incredibly thoughtful questions, incredibly great lunch. Thank you for coming out and providing this fantastic backdrop for me. And stay safe and be well.
Is this working? Yes. Okay. Well, first, please help me to thank Thom Shanker. And I hope that it will fit easily into your luggage.
It will.
Yes.
Let's work. Oh, I got the world in my hand.
Exactly.
Thank you so
Paperweight
much.
to remember us by.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much. So our next program will be, many of you will remember Steve Clements, who has visited us a few times. He will be here on May 14th, here at the Pinery, and he will be talking to us about our 2024 election and foreign policy outlook. Always a great topic from Steve. Steve is the founding editor-at-large of Semaphore, and registration is now open. So for this and any other, that will be the last program of what we kind of call our fiscal year. I hope to have our speaker series resume again in August. We have some a great lineup coming up. Definitely confirmed already in September is Jennifer Scuba, who is the author of the book 8 Billion and Counting on the issues related to global population. We are having a conversation also with H.R. McMaster. So fingers crossed. So keep your eye on our website and our newsletters, and we will see you on May 14th. Thank you.